January 1885. A widow with nowhere left in the camp to sleep, no husband, no wage, no man to put his name on a roof for her, and a mountain winter coming down the gulch that could kill a strong man between the bunkhouse and the privy. They drove her up to the old mine to be rid of her, and they meant it the way you mean it when you don't want to watch. What none of those men understood, men who spent their days inside the mountain, was the one thing the mountain had been trying to teach them all along. By the end of that month, the same camp that had run her off would be standing at the tunnel mouth in the dark, begging the widow to let them into the hole in the rock. But in January, it was just the camp tidying up a problem. Her name was Edith Conroy, 33. Her husband Frank had been a hard rock miner, and the Calloway seam took him the way it took men, a slab let go in the dark, and that was the end of the conversation. The company owned the house, the way the company owned everything, and a dead miner's widow with no children was a line they wanted cleared off the ledger. They gave her 2 weeks and a sympathetic face, and when the 2 weeks were up, they gave her nothing at all. The men weren't cruel, exactly. They were busy, and the winter was coming, and it was easier to decide she'd go to Denver than to ask how. One of the shift bosses, half as a joke, said she could always move into the old Ophir adit up the gulch if she liked it underground so much. The men laughed. It was the kind of thing you say to a person you've already stopped seeing. Edith heard it. And then she walked up the gulch to look at the Ophir adit, because she had spent 4 years married to a miner, and she had heard 100 times the thing the camp said and never once believed. The deep rock is warm. Not the mouth of a tunnel. The mouth is as cold as the day. But go in far enough, past where the daylight quits and the frost can't follow, and the mountain holds a steady 50 degrees the year around. Frank had come up out of the Calloway in January, soaked through with his own sweat while the surface froze men solid. It's summer all year down there, he used to say, peeling off a wet shirt in the cold. Hell of a thing. We freeze on top of the only warm place for a mile. The Ophir was a played-out adit, a horizontal tunnel driven flat into the hillside, timbered and abandoned when the ore pinched out. Dry, sound, and 100 feet back into the mountain, it would sit at 50 degrees through the worst night the sky could make. The men had handed her, as an insult, the warmest shelter in the whole gulch. She had a week of hard weather before the real cold. She spent it making a tomb into a home. She picked a spot 80 feet in, past the reach of the outside air, where Frank's own rules said the rock would hold its warmth. She walled off the tunnel ahead of her and behind with waste timber and stacked deadwood and old ore sacks packed with dry needles, leaving a low passage she could crawl through and seal. She floored her chamber with planks over brush, and at a careful distance, vented out through the timber wall toward the tunnel mouth. She set a small stove of mortared rock and a salvaged length of pipe, small because she did not need much, and because Frank had drilled into her the one law of the deep dark that the careless forget. Bad air doesn't announce itself. She kept the draft honest and a candle burning as her watchman, the way every old miner did, and when the flame stood straight and bright, she knew the air was good. By the time the deep cold came down the gulch, Edith Conroy was 80 feet inside the mountain, dry and walled and warm. At the tunnel mouth, the thermometer read 14 below. Where she slept, on a handful of split wood a night, it held at 51. Down in the camp, they saw a thin smoke seeping from the Ophir mouth and shook their heads and said the widow had gone to ground like a fox and would be just as dead by spring. Then the winter proved the mountain right. The cold came down the second week of January and filled the gulch like water filling a cup. 19 below. 28. A black, still morning, the assay office glass read 39 under zero, and the cold sat in that narrow gulch with nowhere to go and no sun to lift it. The bunkhouse stove glowed cherry red and lost the fight by midnight. A teamster froze in his blankets. 2 men who tried to keep the company office warm burned the furniture, and then the shelving, and then watched the ink freeze in the well. The camp had coal and stoves and walls, and the walls were thin and the gulch was a trap, and one by one the windows went dark. And up the slope, from the mouth of a worked-out mine, a thin breath of smoke rose steady against the killing cold, and the snow at the adit was tracked with the prints of someone plainly, stubbornly alive. A powder man named Hicks saw it first, sent up the gulch to look for anything. He came back swearing the Ophir was breathing smoke. The shift boss said she was burning her last sticks. An old timberman named Pugh, who'd spent 30 years inside mountains, set down his cup and said, "Boy, that's not a fire dying. That's the mountain keeping her. I've felt it. We all have. We just never had the sense to stay." They climbed up on a white dead morning, a knot of frozen men, and stood at the tunnel mouth not knowing how to ask. Then Edith came up out of the dark of the adit with a miner's candle in her hand, sooty, thin, steady-eyed, and looked at the men who'd driven her there. "There's warm air 100 feet back," she said. "Come out of the cold." Before I tell you who came up that gulch last, if you're in the dark of the mountain with Edith now, do one small thing for me. Tap subscribe so the next story finds you. Then let me finish it. By the 3rd week of January, the whole camp had walked up to the Ophir. Edith brought them deep into the mountain in groups, warmed them by her little rock stove, melted snow so they could drink, and taught them, patiently, the way Frank had taught her, what every one of them had felt 1,000 times and never used, that the cold stops at the door of the deep rock, that 50 feet in is warmer than any stove on the surface, that the mountain they cursed all day was the only thing in that gulch trying to keep them alive. Miners learning the mountain from a widow. And on the last morning of the freeze, the company man came up the gulch, the one who'd cleared her off the ledger. His matched team had frozen in their traces. His office was a box of ice. His fingers under the wrappings had gone the color of slate. He stood at the tunnel mouth of the mine he'd handed back to the mountain, the mine he'd thrown her into to save 2 weeks' rent, and he could not get a word out. Edith looked at him a long, long moment, long enough for the 2 weeks and the sympathetic face and the empty hands to come back and stand in the cold between them. Then she said, "Mind the low spot and follow the candle." He went back into the dark she'd been driven into and sat among the men his ledger had nearly killed, kept alive by the mountain he'd never once respected. He didn't apologize. But when he came out, he stood blinking at the tunnel mouth and said the house in camp was hers if she wanted it, and a pension besides, and for once the company kept a promise. Because the newspaper in Denver had already run the line by then. The widow the mountain kept. Every man in that gulch had testified, and there are some debts even a company can't talk its way out of. Edith Conroy didn't take the house. She wintered in the Ophir 3 more years, where it was warmer and quieter, and hers. And in summer, she prospected the worked-out drifts, and in the 2nd year, found the seam the Calloway men had walked past in the dark. She died rich and old and underground stubborn, and they say she asked to be buried up the gulch, near the mouth of the mine that kept her, in the only ground for a mile that never truly froze. "We freeze on top of the only warm place for a mile," Frank used to say. Edith just had the sense to go down to it. If you've ever been driven into the dark by people who couldn't see you anymore, and found it was the warmest place around, tell me about it in the comments. And to keep these frontier survival stories coming every week, tap the red subscribe button right below this video.